Welcome to the Athletic FC podcast with me, Ayo Akinwelere. Alexander Isak is adamant he won't play for Newcastle again. So what next? Are there any glimmers of hope for Eddie Howe and his side ahead of the new season? Well, joining us for this one, we have Chris Waugh, Jacob Whitehead, and also Seb Stafford-Bloor as well. All right, big news from David Ornstein in today's deal sheet. It's the Athletic's understanding that Isak is adamant he will never represent Newcastle again. And he has no desire to reintegrate into the squad. Right, let's get the latest from David.
Well, we've known for quite some time that Alexander Isak wants to leave Newcastle United this summer. He hasn't been training with Eddie Howe's squad, nor involved in any of their pre-season matches, and we don't expect him to feature in their Premier League season opener at Aston Villa on Saturday. What we're reporting today on The Athletic is a significant development in that we understand from speaking to people privy to the situation that Isak does not intend to play for Newcastle again, which is pretty stark and gives a sense of how bad this situation has become. We also believe that in his mind, his Newcastle career is over and that he has no desire to reintegrate into the squad if the transfer window closes and no deal has been agreed for his departure. So it feels like a pretty unsustainable situation and needs to be resolved one way or another. In our report, we state that there was conversation between Isak and Eddie Howe 2 weeks before the end of last season in which he told Howe that he wants to leave. And then again, Isak called Howe following Newcastle's final game of the campaign, a defeat at home to Everton, prior to flying to his homeland, Sweden, and reiterated this point. Newcastle's stance throughout has been that Isak is not for sale. They're not looking to trade him. But at the same time, we know that they have been exploring the market for alternatives, potential replacements in the event of it happening, which shows that there is contingency work taking place in the event of him departing St James's Park. One thing's for certain is that we haven't heard the end of this saga just yet.
Chris, this is a story that just won't go away. What do you make of the situation?
Yeah, tell me about it. I was hoping that we weren't going to talk about Alexander Isak today, but well, the latest is that Alexander Isak did not appear in any of Newcastle's pre-season games. He has been training separately from the rest of the squad because he wants to move and wants to move to Liverpool. And Newcastle are adamant from the boardroom down, as they have been throughout, that Alexander Isak is not for sale. Certainly not at the initial 110 million which Liverpool offered earlier this month. Newcastle value him at closer to 150 million. They also believe that they need two strikers to come in before they could even contemplate Alexander Isak leaving, because Callum Wilson, who was their second striker last year, left on a free transfer, and essentially throughout pre-season they had Will Asula, who's never started a Premier League match, playing up front, and then it ended with Anthony Gordon, a winger, playing as a false nine. It looks like he is set to do that at Aston Villa in the opening game this weekend. So Isak is being quite intransigent, though. He seems to be trying to do all he can to force this move through. There has been no real reconciliation yet between him and the club. The club are sticking to their hard line. Alexander Isak sticking to his hard line. And for now, it just feels like this is going to drag on probably until the end of the transfer window. It's one of those very, very tedious sagas which you tend to get. You tend to get one at least every summer. I think Newcastle have been surprised by how Alexander Isak has acted and how hardline he has been in this approach, but clearly he wants that move. His mind is made up, and as things stand, it seems like it's going to be very, very difficult to coax him back round. But Newcastle are still leaving the door open for that. They believe that he can and will be reintegrated, but Isak and his people seem to be arguing otherwise. So it's just you speak to one side and get one, and it's a complete opposite on the other.
Jacob, what do you make of all of this? I mean, I didn't see this happening. I felt Newcastle were semi in control of the situation, but now it feels like there's no redemption here.
Yeah, and I mean, to build on what Chris was saying, this essential dissonance between the two sides is what's causing loads of the issue. I mean, if you speak to Isak's people, they say, oh, well, we'd agreed that this was going to be his last season, or we'd made our intention clear for a long time. And if you speak to Newcastle, it's like, this is news to us. We were happy to enter negotiations for a new contract, and neither side are budging on that. In terms of Isak's latest update that he won't represent Newcastle again, I mean, this is ultimately like a leverage question. And it's something which always happens in transfers, and everyone uses all the leverage they can. Isak can't really hand in a formal transfer request. He might, but at this point, I guess there's a risk to that in the sense of there's financial implications to that in terms of giving up future earnings. And so he's kind of relying, it's a bit of a gambit on the idea that Newcastle aren't going to want to pay wages to a player that doesn't want to pay. And also weighing that for every month he's sitting on his sofa, he'll get close to the end of his contract and he'll lose value to Newcastle. And Newcastle may think we don't want to sell, but if we have this player who is our biggest asset, then it's better to sell on our terms when his value is as high as possible. So Isak will be thinking, worst case, I just stay and Newcastle will eventually blink first. It's a risk, but it's one which is a card he's evidently broken out with 3 weeks of a transfer window still to go.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, look, Seb, Isak won't be the first person to put his heels down and say he wants to leave a club. I think about Harry Kane back in 2021. Inevitably, Harry Kane ended up staying for another couple of years at Spurs. But I mean, this is such a strange situation because it's yet again that battle between player versus club. Who's in control in this situation?
Yeah, nobody really. It's funny because this morning I was watching a video on YouTube about Jimmy Floyd Hasselbank leaving Leeds in 1999. So it's like 26 years ago. And it's remarkable how similar that was. The amounts of money have changed, of course, and the means by which players express themselves have changed. But yeah, it really is nothing new. And I think the key with it, and this is really, really hard because anytime this happens, there are a whole group of fans who are emotionally invested in the future of what is an excellent player. You can't believe anybody, ever. And you're just hearing 2 different versions of the truth. And almost always, the actual reality sits somewhere in between. And beyond a certain point, it also becomes a face-saving exercise with everybody trying to give, their best side to, the kind of the fans, the media, whoever. And it just becomes terribly, terribly messy. And in the middle of fans who, of course, are thinking about the season and what do we do next? And then the question of, well, if he does go, what do we do after that? What do we do with the revenue? And it never, ever gets any better. And it's a saga as old as the game itself, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, is this a conversation, Jacob, about player power versus club power? Who's actually in control here? Who holds the cards? But also you think about how social media and certain protagonists on social media can extrapolate this. I mean, it sort of leaves this cauldron where fans are like, just get rid of him, or clubs are like, well, we've still got an asset on our hands.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think Isak himself hasn't necessarily been powering this through social media. It's much more sort of being played out behind closed doors and conversations with people. I think it's an interesting one about whether players have more power now, because in some ways, like transfers, for example, or personal brand, they do. In a lot of other ways, I think they sometimes have less, in the sense of clubs also have the ability to shape their own narratives, and the speed that blowback can come, I think, often means that players are less able to speak out about certain things, whether it's their opinion on political events which are going on in the world at the moment, and they're very limited in terms of what they can say. So power in limited areas, certainly, overall. I don't know if I'd want to be a footballer on social media today.
It's interesting though, Chris, isn't it? Like, because, we talk about player power, we talk about club power. In my eyes, I'm looking at Newcastle and thinking, well, he's still got how many years left on his contract? This player is a Newcastle, quote unquote, and it's probably not the right word to say, but it really is. He's still an asset of Newcastle Football Club. Yeah,
and I mean, you speak to people at Newcastle to the very top, and they say he's got 3 years left in his contract. We are going to hold him to that if we don't get the offer that we want for him. And that's where, I mean, Jacob was talking earlier about not handing transfer requests and the reason not to. And I get to a degree why he hasn't, but the optics of him doing what he is doing and not handing a transfer request just fuels the sort of anger. And I think that's why there's more frustration. In some ways, I actually think if he handed in a transfer request and then Newcastle ended up keeping him because a deal didn't happen, at least fans could turn around and say, well, he tried to do it in the right way, quote unquote, or at least try doing that. Whereas now it just seems like, well, I'm just going to sit on my hands. I'm not actually going to hand in a transfer request. I'll go everywhere and up to that point, but not actually doing that. And so I think the player does have a decent amount of power, but Newcastle's ownership in particular, I think there's a at least an element of sort of wanting to save face and making sure that they aren't seen to back down. And there is also an important message that it sends to other players in the squad. I know there's a concern internally that if they were to give in to Isak's demands and sort of let him go without really getting a sort of price that they would want and having replacements in the door, then what happens next summer if it's Anthony Gordon or if it's Sandro Tonali or if it's somebody else who wants to go and Newcastle want to keep them? They don't want to sort of set a precedent that they feel that they could just let these players leave. Now, every single player has a price and every single player does have a sort of period where it feels like they need to go. And I do think we're at that stage with Isak, but at the same time, Newcastle have been so hardline in their stance all summer that I don't think they can suddenly just buckle in that regard. And there's going to need to be a bit of to and fro from both sides. But it does seem, it's bizarre. It is one of those, we have this with transfers a lot where you speak to one side and get one thing and the complete opposite. But if you were to spend an afternoon speaking to people in and around Alexander Isak, you'd be convinced there's absolutely no chance that he stays. He's definitely going. But you speak to people in Newcastle and there's absolutely no chance that he's going. And the reality is going to be somewhere in between. It's going to be one or the other, but there's going to have to be compromise one way. And those two positions have to be mutually exclusive. They can't work together. And as things stand right now, I can't give a prediction as to where this goes. I'd say I'd probably be sort of 70-30 at this stage that he stays, just because I don't see Newcastle signing two players of a level that they would want and Liverpool paying enough money for Newcastle to cede to that demand. But that's me basing it on the fact that most of my conversations have been with people at Newcastle all summer and they have not shifted in their position. The final 3 weeks of a transfer window, strange things do happen though, and positions do shift quite drastically.
Yeah, Seb, you touched on something that got me thinking actually. You know, when a player kisses the badge, are we saying we can't fall in love with them? Because by all accounts, I mean, Newcastle are in a great position. You know, they've got Champions League football. You know, they've brought a cup to the club for the first time in how many years? I mean, they're in a good space to kick on. Why shouldn't a player like that stay on?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also it always feels to me as if the level of prestige in the game exists in a little bit of a time lag. So you can be in Newcastle's position, just won the League Cup, you qualified for the Champions League, wonderful club going in the right direction, club very, very wealthy, obviously. And yet a lot of the prestige still resides with Liverpool, Manchester United. Liverpool obviously is a slightly different case. They're reigning Premier League champions. They're enormously strong, clearly a very, very talented squad. But you know, if you're Brian Mbeumo, who was a sort of childhood fan of Manchester United, it's still the brightest stage for whatever reason. And I think the game takes a little bit of time to catch up on these things. And also, it's a terrible cliche, but how long, obviously a footballer's career is short, but how long is a footballer's prime? Even shorter. Maybe you get 3 or 4 years at the height of your powers, the ability to not just play in the Champions League, but to compete in it, to go right to the final stages, knockout rounds. And you've always got to put yourself in a player's shoes. And it's very difficult because for us, it's an unimaginable reality, right? The money, the wealth, the celebrity, it's completely unattainable for 99.9% of the population. But then you look at players, what do they want to achieve? What do they want to achieve post-football? What kind of financial setup are they trying to build around themselves? Who are they supporting? All of these questions. And almost always you have no idea. They're like icebergs. You don't see the stuff beneath the surface. I'm not saying any of that applies to Alexander Isak, but that is usually the context in which a lot of this stuff happens. Even normal transfers where there's no acrimony, everything's fine, quick negotiation, he's a new player in 4 days, all that kind of stuff. But it's always worth considering, and even if fans don't really want to hear it.
Okay, I just want to quickly press you, Chris, before we move on potential incomings. Adam Crafton and David Ornstein have reported that Newcastle are considering a move for Porto striker Samu Agahawa. Also, Nicholas Jackson's been in the frame. You said there's a likelihood that Isak does stay on. Do you think either of those two targets are enough to appease fans if they do come in and Isak goes?
I mean, if Isak was to go, there just has to be an acceptance that you're not going to replace him like for like. There is no like for like replacement for Alexander Isak, which is why this situation is ongoing. If Liverpool theoretically have that disposable income to be able to spend on a striker, they are going for who they see to be the very best in the world, or has the potential to be the very best in the world. There certainly isn't going to be someone with 3 years Premier League experience who is of that equivalence. Now, Samu Agawa is definitely somebody Newcastle have watched and do like. I think there's a feeling that he isn't necessarily ready for the Premier League, and the potential price that it would cost to get him across would be prohibitive. The same with Nicholas Jackson. I think that some aspects of his play Newcastle like, some people at Newcastle like, but I think there are also question marks about him and maybe what he's done at Newcastle. He was sent off at St James's Park for a sort of petulant, stupid act towards the back end of last season, and that is fresh in the minds. Johan Visser, Newcastle really want to sign, but he's seen as a replacement for Callum Wilson. That's been communicated as well during sort of negotiations, that he isn't the replacement like for the replacement to come in place of Alexander Isak. It would have to be a sort of mix and match approach, and Newcastle are looking across Europe and across the Premier League. They like Ollie Watkins, but that would be a very difficult deal to do, and I think there isn't, certainly Newcastle don't want to sign two players towards the back end of their 20s in Visser and Watkins as well. The ownership would be keen instead for Newcastle to sign one of those strikers as somebody younger, which makes sense again, certainly in a PSR and development sort of world. So Newcastle, as things stand, A, believe that Isak will stay, and B, don't believe that they can get replacements of a level that they would feel was sufficient going into the start of the season. You may end up having a sort of lessened Alexander Isak, because if he's not fully engaged, even if he does start playing again, then he probably isn't going to be the Alexander Isak of last season and the season before. But equally, that's better than nobody at all, and maybe it gives them a bit longer to really consider who they want to be their next frontline striker, and then that gives them the season, or up to January at least, to try and really plot that. Whereas at the minute, everyone realises how desperate they are, and prices are being reflected as such.
Yeah, Jacob, I guess what makes the Isak situation a little tricky, as we've probably covered, is that Newcastle are also struggling to bring in replacements. And Chris, please jump in after this, because I'm interested to hear your perspective on this. Why do you think it's quite difficult for them to land quite a few of the top targets? Because, I mean, we've talked about it several times, and Buemo and 7 other players that they wanted and just haven't come.
Yeah, it's quite entertaining. I think Newcastle have been quite aggressively briefing, we've only been turned down officially by 4. Only 4. I mean, it's still quite a few.
You don't know who else was on the list.
Yeah. As Seb alluded to earlier, I think he's completely right talking about the lag with historic club size. And if you think about their really good recruitment a few years ago when they brought in the likes of Guimaraes, Sven Botman, they weren't necessarily, they were aiming for a very high level of player, but they weren't necessarily competing with Champions League clubs. They were able to put in big demands and get them, when they're fighting against maybe teams in Serie A, for example, who are less budget. They aren't doing that anymore. They're now shopping, in the champagne house, as it were. And that means that they come into this as a risk. There are other aspects. I mean, the optics haven't been great with signing players this window, but I don't think that that's a major one. The more significant one I'd say is that they are limited quite a lot on wage structure in terms of not wanting to exceed it. That's part of the reason even last window why they didn't necessarily feel like they're able to offer Isak, for example, a huge contract to stay, because then you have your other likes, you have Guimaraes and Botman and Jolinton and players like that who are all at a similar sort of band, and to do that means that they all have to go up and Newcastle end up back in sort of a bit of a PSR hellhole. It all feeds off each other a bit, but ultimately I think when you're trying to break into the top 6, you're breaking into them not just on the league table, but breaking into them in a brand sense as well. It's been Newcastle's big challenge for the last 2 years, and this is another way in which it's playing out.
Yeah, Jacob makes a good point. Chris, be honest, is the brand an issue, potentially?
The brand is an issue to a certain degree, and it is that Newcastle are a Champions League club for this season, but it's not that they're an established Champions League club yet. And there is still, at least for players, I think, more coming from abroad than anything else, there's still the allure of London or Manchester. That is something which, as much as I would champion everything about the northeast of England and Newcastle, and people who then move here and live here love it, that's a hard sell beforehand, particularly when you don't have the cachet of those clubs and the trophies to be able to point to. Now, Jacob makes a very good point about the different market Newcastle are sort of shopping in now. Basically, whenever they come up in competition with one of those very biggest clubs, they've missed out on these players. And you mentioned that the Newcastle are briefing about there being 4 players who've turned them down. I think that's the 4 players they've actually bid for who they've missed out on. There are more players. I mean, Brian Mbeumo, for example, they didn't actually make club-to-club contact because they already knew beforehand that he didn't want to come, that he wanted to go to Manchester United. But I also think if you look at it's a very difficult position for them being, because you can argue in one sense that if they hadn't gone for those players, they're going to be then taking a step down, and they could have maybe quite easily signed players of a lower quality, and then it would have seemed like a seamless transfer window, and they've brought in all these players. But are they the right players that they necessarily want, who they think are going to kick them on to the next level? The difference with when they signed Bruno Guimaraes and Sandro Tonali, for example, is that Newcastle actually have those players now. So to sign players who are either an upgrade or a level of going to push them means that it's more difficult than when you're just signing a player who is better than what they necessarily had before. And so it is a very difficult market. They're in that sort of in-betweeny time where they really need to be in the Champions League season after season. They need their general commercial revenues to keep growing so they can start offering those wages. It's the biggest cliche in football, because it's true that generally the more money that is spent on wages over a longer period of time will bring you success, and Newcastle can't compete with that. They have a very rigid wage structure because they have. That's partly the reason why we're in this situation with Alexander Isak, because when Paul Mitchell arrived as sporting director last summer, Isak felt that he'd earned a new contract, which had sort of been suggested to him he could have one. But at that point, Newcastle had just had to sell players to comply with the Premier League's profit and sustainability rules, to give one of the highest earners an extended contract, when at the time he had 4 years left on it. Just did not make any financial sense from a club who want to bring in better players going forward. They hadn't signed any players for 3 transfer windows before this window that's just arrived. I actually think the business they've done has been good business. Malik Chow should be announced imminently as a centre-back. They've brought in Anthony Elanga, who I think is an upgrade, or certainly pushes Jacob Murphy in the right wing. They're 2 problem positions long-term they've needed to solve. And they've also brought in Aaron Ramsdale as a backup goalkeeper who may push Nick Pope for number 1. The problem is that they don't have a centre forward and they can't score goals. So it looks like that they're glaring omission at the top end of the pitch, but actually, and the rest of the field, I think they actually have decent competition now. It's just making sure they have that final part, and it doesn't feel. It's going to feel like this window is unfinished, because either they're going to have a diminished Alexander Isak, or they're going to have scrambled around to bring in a couple of players, which will be a relative gamble, because they just don't think there's anyone who can offer anything close to what Alexander Isak can.
Seb, I'll be honest, I worry that Newcastle aren't able to bring in players, but I also have to commend the work that Eddie Howe's done. Chris has talked about, barely bringing in players over the last 3 transfer windows, and look where they're at right now. We look at the cup that they've won, look at the fact that they climbed up the table, and look at the fact that they're in the Champions League, which is exactly where they want to be. He's been known to better players, Isak being one of them. Do you think he's also a bit of a problem? I guess Guardiola comes calling and the conversation might be slightly different, for instance.
I mean, versus every coach, Guardiola has an advantage because, he's an icon of the game. He's a high priest of this generation of football. So, that's never a fair fight. Eddie Howe was talking a couple of days ago, and I was listening to him. I think it was in response to a question about Isak. And he said, and I'm paraphrasing his answer, but he said, look, if you look at all the players that have come through, there are very few players that haven't got better or haven't benefited from being here, and players who've come to Newcastle have done great things. And I think he makes a really good point. Sandro Tonali, Bruno Guimaraes. Guimaraes was not what he is now before he arrived from Lyon, and he's clearly developed under Eddie Howe. And I think also, Chris mentioned him, but Jacob Murphy was thought of really as a kind of a championship player. Now, and now he comfortably of a kind of a mid to higher mid-table level in the Premier League. I just think that it's never about an individual coach necessarily, unless it's a Guardiola type person or a Mourinho in the past. It's more the whole package. And I think the other thing here is that if you're a player, and think of a player as a sort of an industry in his own right, and he's got commercial agreements, or he wants to have them, and he's thinking about the platform he could have and what he could do with his level of performance as it is, not sort of theoretically how he might improve. It's very hard to compete with these kind of prestige clubs. And Manchester United versus Newcastle, we just had that with Benjamin Šeško. It just doesn't really matter that Manchester United don't look very well coached and the stadium isn't in particularly good condition and there are protests against the ownership. It's still just Manchester United and the name up in lights. So it's really, really hard.
Yeah, certainly if you speak to anyone at Bournemouth or Newcastle, they would absolutely wax lyrical about Eddie Howe. But whether that reputation has extended beyond certainly England and into Europe is something which I think it probably hasn't yet. Newcastle's one season in the Champions League, they didn't progress from the group stage. If they do well this year, it might be different. But just a story about when Sandro Tonali was convinced to join Newcastle. He really needed some convincing to begin with, and it was actually, I'm told, one of the conversations he had with Eddie Howe, which wowed him, because Howe didn't walk into the room, or didn't speak to him, I don't know if it was over the phone or in the room. He didn't just say to him, though, you are wonderful, I just want you to sign. He said, you're great, but he actually said, these are all of the areas I will improve you. I will make you one of the best midfielders in Europe, because I can improve you here, I can improve you here, I can improve you here. And Tonali, and I've heard this about several other players, was sort of stunned about the fact that the amount of due diligence that had been done on him, and also the fact that it wasn't just, I'll blow smoke up your backside, this is where I will improve you. And maybe that doesn't work for all players. Maybe some players just have the ego, certainly at that sort of level, where they just want to be told, you're wonderful, you come here. But Eddie Howe, because he is so meticulous, that he will say, this is where we're going to make you even better. And so in that sense, I think he has actually been someone who has attracted players to Newcastle. It's been the opposite effect for at least some of them, but I'm not saying that there haven't been examples where perhaps, certainly the way that it's worked out this summer, the other clubs and maybe even other coaches have been able to convince players ahead of Newcastle. But certainly Eddie Howe has had big success with one of Newcastle's very best players.
It's worth remembering also, right, that sort of when a transfer takes place, as we all know, that there's a conversation which happens in the background, and it happens sometimes for months in advance, and it involves people that aren't necessarily always seen as the kind of the figurehead of a club. So if you think about the Šeško situation, so Newcastle without a sporting director, without a CEO, dealing with an agent who was a little bit idiosyncratic, had his quirks, and had a way that he imagined the process would go, which we've reported in our kind of background to that Manchester United transfer. And you think about kind of the different approaches there and the different people involved. So Newcastle, as an outsider, I'm sure Chris and Jake will be able to correct me, not really sure who the kind of the prominent voice in that conversation is. For Manchester United, beyond Matt Hargreaves, you've also got, and Jason Wilcox, you've also got Christopher Weivel, who signed Šeško twice in the past, who has been a big part and a big driving force in his career, both in bringing him to RB Salzburg and then promoting him really to RB Leipzig. You need to get that stuff right. And I'm not saying that kind of things like the city you live in and, the stage you play on and the size, all that stuff isn't important, but those bits matter too. Like the conversation you're having and the sell is super important to make players feel comfortable. I remember I was reporting on a transfer earlier this summer and involved a player who was moving to a club in the Premier League, and he was very, very keen on it because it involved working with someone who'd been quite prominent in his youth career, and someone he felt he trusted, and someone who, when they told him, hey, this is how we imagine the next couple of years going in your career, believed him because they've worked before and he's been proven correct to this point. And these little bits, they matter, and also they take time to develop. Like when you've grown as quickly as Newcastle have, and they're kind of from being where they were to being a Champions League contender, sometimes it takes a little bit of time for those things to catch up. Same way as the kind of the time lag around the prestige bit, but it's all part of the same problem, I think.
Yeah, and one thing that just popped to mind as Seb was saying that, Chris, was something that Jacob brought up earlier, was the idea of optics. There's no CEO, there's no sporting director. Like, you want to come join a team that says they're ambitious and they're big and they want to go places, but those things aren't sort of already in place. Those optics can't be great necessarily for someone who now wants to join this club, because you want to see all that joined upness to know that everyone's moving in the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, there's an irony here that Newcastle actually under Mike Ashley did operate without a CEO or a sporting director previously. So if there was a club who theoretically...
Not well.
Yeah, not well. If there's a club who theoretically could maybe get away with it, it would be Newcastle. But if you want them to be... I mean, last year, Newcastle had a tumultuous summer in a different way, and that was because there was an idea that they wanted to professionalise the structure. They wanted to make it more of an executive level structure. And Amanda Staveley, who'd been operating as co-owner, but essentially as a sort of de facto second CEO, left, and then instead there was a structure that was brought in which had the sporting director, and seemingly Eddie Howe was going to be moved more into that. He has been head coach throughout, but really his power was almost going to be checked to a certain degree, and that he wouldn't be as heavily involved in transfers. A summer on, and it's basically the complete opposite, because that structure isn't there anymore. Darren Neal's the CEO, has very unfortunately had to leave his position because He suffered a medical condition, a chronic medical condition. He needs to receive treatment. And the sporting director, Paul Mitchell, resigned and left on June the 30th. So instead, Newcastle have been working with the sort of interim transfer team, which involves Andy Howe, Eddie Howe's nephew, who's assistant head of recruitment, and also Steve Nixon, who is the head of recruitment, and then also Eddie Howe himself. And so it doesn't feel like a quote-unquote modern structure. It doesn't feel like you would have that at most of the very biggest clubs in the world, that there wouldn't be these people in those positions, particularly for a transfer window as important as this. And the sort of almost jokes within football that you speak to people within football and they say, well, who actually would make the decision on Alexander Isak not being sold? Because who do you speak to? And it is almost at boardroom level. Eddie Howe has said that publicly. It's going to be a boardroom level because there isn't someone who's making those decisions right now. And so the optics of that aren't great. I certainly don't think that it's been fair on anyone at the club that's had to operate in this way, and lessons need to be learned. And PIF would probably argue, I mean, they never speak, but they're Newcastle's majority owners. They would probably argue that every decision they make is very process driven, is the buzzword, the buzz sentence that we hear all the time. Yeah, which basically means things take a long time. They make decisions over them, and that the next CEO, who is it's likely to be David Hopkinson, who was previously at Real Madrid as an executive, but has also worked in North America at some of the very biggest groups there, certainly on the business side. And then the next sporting director we expect is likely to be Ross Wilson, who's currently at Nottingham Forest as their chief football officer. That they would argue that we've waited for the right people, and if we get the right people in place longer term, that will work. But that hasn't worked up till this stage. Newcastle have burned through 2 sporting directors in the last 2 years. They've obviously needed a new CEO, which was for unfortunate circumstances, but they actually need some longevity. They need direction. And at the moment, it's difficult to know exactly what this quote-unquote project is because there just aren't the people there to really set those long-term goals in place beyond the footballing side.
It's been emphasised over and over that the delay, I've heard from sources at the top of PIF, and it doesn't help that Yasser Rahman is ultimately the man who needs to make these decisions. He's extremely high up in the Saudi hierarchy. He's chairman of Aramco. He's very close with MBS. He's got about 1 billion other jobs, including his other love child, Liv Golf. And this is the man all decisions have to go through. And, you know, even though this is seen as being Newcastle is his project, his baby within PIF, how high is it towards the top of his agenda? How quickly is he going to be signing off on the likes of David Hopkinson, Ross Wilson? Like, this is essentially what the delay is, and it's suboptimal for Newcastle.
Yeah, definitely is. All right, Seb, I know you've got to go, but really appreciate you joining us on the pod today. You've really added a lot of value.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Added value.
Added value, right?
My ex
Did a real Eddie Howe on that.
All right, I'll see you, boys. Bye-bye.
So Newcastle may have just been on a run of 6 games without a win in pre-season, but there are still signs for their fans, especially around optimism, to cling on to. It's not all doom and gloom, Jacob. You know, Sunderland are back in the Premier League. A nice derby there for Newcastle fans. But also, let's not forget, Champions League football still to look forward to as well.
Your use of cling belies the sort of nature of that question. Really,
there's also nothing nice about that derby.
Leave me be, man. I'm trying to give optimism to these lads and women who follow this club through thick and thin.
Chris made a really good point earlier that if you take the Isak situation out of it, there are clear upgrades in a number of positions, and that is the case. It is just the huge lingering thing of Alexander Isak, but this is a team who are still on the up over the last 3 or 4 seasons. I think they do have bigger fish to throw on their plate than Sunderland, to be quite honest. But I mean, so much. I mean, last season, Newcastle did not start well. And the mood around the team is so quickly changed by that. If they get off to a strong start and, you know, win 3 or 4 of the first 5 games, and it's going to shift so quickly. They're like, we're really quickly going to be lost in the minutiae of VAR decisions, the 4-3-3, that, you know, there is reason for confidence if Newcastle back it up, ultimately.
Little sprinkles of hope there, Chris. Elanga's another one, of course, and also Malik Thiaw as well, potentially close to completing a deal. I mean, there have to be more players coming in before the window closes, surely.
Without doubt, Newcastle definitely, even if Alexander Isak stays, Newcastle need another striker, because at the moment, Will Asula, as I said earlier, hasn't started a Premier League match, and he started the first few pre-season games. You can see he's still very raw. That's the thing he's basically been defined by during his first year or so at Newcastle, but he's just not ready to lead the line in the Premier League, if he ever indeed will be. The backup number 9 Newcastle have is Sean Neve, who's an exciting 18-year-old prospect, but he's not made a Actually, he's ironically has a League Cup winners medal, but hasn't actually made a first team competitive appearance yet. And Anthony Gordon is going to be leading the line, which is certainly not ideal. So in that position, they also need another midfielder ideally, because Sean Longstaff has left, and I think it was probably the right time for him to go. And Newcastle have made a PSR benefit from the fact that he's an academy graduate, and the money they've banked there, albeit not a huge fee, but the close to 15 million means that they can use all of that to reinvest. But they have Champions League football this season. Eddie Howe plays with 3 midfielders, and Joe Willock is already going to be missing the next month with an injury. Joe Linton's injury record hasn't been brilliant. They need at least one of the number 8 to come in there. I actually think when Jacob mentioned whether a team can have a good or bad start of the season, we've seen that over the last 2 years with Newcastle, that a couple of years ago they had a poor start after actually hammering Aston Villa on the first day 5-1. They then went on a difficult run, and it sort of seeped into the rest of the season, whereas in other years, when last year they actually started quite well results-wise, if the performances weren't there, and that sort of momentum can snowball either way. Newcastle's fixture list looks very difficult to begin with. They've got Villa away and Liverpool at home, but actually, if you were to pick a game for Anthony Gordon to be a sort of false 9 in, I think Aston Villa away wouldn't necessarily be the worst one. If you were at home against a side you had to sort of break down, I think it would be worse. But if Newcastle can use that pace of Barnes and then Anthony Elanga and Anthony Gordon break through the middle, if Aston Villa play a high line, I don't think that's necessarily the worst match for that to be approaching. Then Newcastle host Liverpool at St James's Park, and that is going to be absolutely febrile atmosphere. It's going to be, there's no motivation Newcastle will need given the summer that they've had so far, so everyone is going to be on their side, and that is a very, very difficult match against the champions. But for them to walk into that atmosphere, I think that will really kick Newcastle on a gear. So I'm trying to pick the positives out of that there, of what look like 2 very, very daunting fixtures, but at the same time I do actually, in a perverse sort of way, think they have a pretty good chance in both of them.
Okay, before we go, what's the expectation for Newcastle this season, gents? I'm sure the hierarchy will be having conversations with Eddie Howe, or he's pulling his hair out saying, give me some more time to get some players through the door. But what's the expectation?
I think some of it depends on how self-aware the board are. That they're the ones who have caused some of the issues with their delays appointing a CEO and sporting director, by which you'd hope that Eddie Howe would be given a bit more grace. I think realistically the expectation has to be to aim to qualify for the Champions League again. Obviously, it's even tougher this year in the sense that there's more games, which will stretch the squad even more, and we saw what impact that had 2 seasons ago. But continued progress has to, I guess, be the ideal, and that's what would represent that continued progress.
Yeah, what do you think, Chris?
I think that, last year the stated goal from the CEO and the sporting director was European football. There is no CEO or sporting director now, so who would set that goal right now is sort of difficult to find. But I think that it would be similar again. I don't think there's necessarily the expectation that Newcastle have to get back in the Champions League. That would be the desire, but I don't think that's necessarily the expectation. I think a sort of top 6, top 7 finish, hopefully have another cup run, and then certainly get through the first stage of the Champions League. It's different to 2 years ago when Newcastle had the glamour ties, but actually had the sort of quote-unquote group of death within the Champions League and didn't end up getting through it in the end, just missed out on the last day and didn't even get into Europa League as you used to drop down into. Whereas now, the new format, I think, suits Newcastle. They are probably going to be one of the lowest ranked seeds, but actually that works against other sides because you have to play 2 teams in each of the 4 seed pots, regardless of what seed you are. And so other sides will be getting Newcastle as a lowest ranked seed, and that'll be more difficult than a lot of the other lowest ranked seeds. So I think Newcastle have a very good chance of getting in that top sort of 24, and then hopefully having that 2-legged tie and maybe even progressing further in the Champions League. If they can do similar to what Aston Villa have done this year, I think that would represent a very good season for Newcastle. But to do that, they're going to need to find some goals from somewhere, whether that's basically coaxing Alexander Isak to play at 70% for the season in a huff, or whether that's they sell him and they do find some sort of stopgap solution this year up front and then really think about how they're going to address that going forward.
All right, gents, let's end it there. Jacob, Seb, who joined us earlier, and also Chris, thank you so much for your time. And also thank you guys for watching as well. Don't forget to like the video and also subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and also leave us a comment as well. Right, we're back soon. For more from the Athletic FC podcast, make sure you like and subscribe to the channel. We've got top journalists like David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anker, and plenty more through the entire season. Make sure you don't miss an episode of the Athletic FC. You can get it wherever you get your podcasts from.